Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead, and back with us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to talk about the principles of growth and body composition of dairy cattle. Dr. Kertz, great to have you with us. I think we're going to do a little reviewing of what's known to date, and then you're going to put some perspective to that topic. So, before we get started, though, I want to make a note that if you scroll down, you can find Dr. Kertz's most current Feedstuffs column. So I invite you to check that out if you want to explore this topic in more depth. So, Al, I'm going to turn this over to you. Give us a bit of history on what's known when it comes to the principles of growth and body condition in dairy cattle.
Well, Sarah, this is a good topic that I probably should have done a number of years ago because it explains a lot about what I've been writing about and talking about. And it begins with a classic review in 1955 in the Journal of Dairy Science by Dr. Tom Reed at Cornell, who became my major professor. And it's still a very good basic review. And some of the things they sorted out was, first of all, there's an inverse relationship between body water and body fat. So as animals fatten, that fat displaces water in their body. The second point is that the percentages of water, protein, and mineral approach what they called a chemical maturity. So when the animals mature, those proportions added together are somewhere around 73%. That's fat free because fat is a major variable in body composition. And this percentage of 73% can vary somewhat depending on a variety of other factors. Now, carbohydrates haven't come into this equation because they really aren't very significant at all. Only about 0.5%, and most of that is glycogen in the liver stores. So it's a very small percentage, not something usually that has to be accounted for. Age, as you might imagine, is highly correlated with the percent of fat-free body composition, and that this is somewhat curvilinear. It may be curvilinear at the far end because it can reflect the loss of mineral content in bones. Now, some of the key studies in this whole cattle area were done at the University of Missouri, way preceding me in the early 1910s and 20s and 30s by two authors named Waters and Mumford. And interestingly, there are two buildings on the Ag campus named after them. Then along came Sam Brody later, and he did his prodigious studies and published his book in 1964, which is still a classic, Bioenergetics and Growth. It's not available anymore. If you go online, which I did last week and looked, I found one copy for $395. So it's still a well-regarded reference book. So this might have all been a factor in why there was a major symposium held at the university in May of 1967 on body composition in animals and man. And interestingly, that proceedings is still available as a download at the National Academy of Sciences Press. And I provide that link. So you can actually download, it doesn't cost you anything, that book as a reference. At that time, I was dually enrolled as an undergraduate and graduate student. So I was able to meet Dr. John Thomas Reed. He goes by Tom, as he was a speaker and organizer at that symposium. That led to my becoming one of his graduate students about 3 years later. The reason for 3 years is I was finishing a master's degree at Missouri. I had a 2-year Army obligation, active duty, and that adds up to 3 years. And then in the fall of 1970, I began my PhD work with Dr. Tom Reed at Cornell. The timing was very good because I wanted to broaden my background, and he and a professor, Dr. George Wellington, who was involved in a 1955 paper as a co-author as well. He was in meat, and they came up with a major project to address a number of issues. And so we had two breeds, very distinctly different, Angus and Holstein. We had bulls, steers, and heifers. We had two levels of intake with one common diet, an ad libitum level and a 70% of that. And then we had matching pairs of Holstein and Angus, where we had a baseline of 400 pounds, and a baseline set of cattle were slaughtered and measured. And then at 600, 800, and 1,000 pounds were the other reference points. And all these animals then were slaughtered to measure body composition, chemical and physical. In addition, there was a replication of that. Another group of animals were handled the same way. So this covers a period of time and quite a few graduate students. And among those graduate students were two from Chile, Siegfried Simpfendorfer, and then Rene Enrique, and one from Colombia, Horacio Ayala, two from Canada, Andre Fortin from Quebec, and David Sims from Saskatchewan. And then another graduate student in meats from Mali, West Africa, Almazar Maiga. And so all of these animals were slaughtered and physically dissected. In addition, I did some very detailed analysis on plasma, insulin, and growth hormone, and some of the major muscle sites for DNA and RNA cellular growth. Did some of the major fat depots for lipogenesis measurements, and those were later published in a kind of a station bulletin, and you can find the reference on that and the list of references for this. I was also the project coordinator because it was quite a major project to keep going. And some of the key findings we had were that, not surprisingly, bulls, followed by steers and then heifers, were the most anabolic. That means they had the greatest protein and mineral deposition, but less fat in that order. And then Holsteins had later fat deposition externally and more internally than the Angus. And we'll come back to that point in a minute or two. And then there were differences, were quantitative and partly published, as I said, in two journal publications as well as in some others. And unfortunately, Dr. Reed had an untimely death in 1979, which actually prevented us from doing some further publications. And then one animal especially stood out. It was an Angus bull. He was paired at the lower level of intake, but to his pair mate Angus high level intake bull, he grew as fast, more efficiently. He had more protein deposition, less fat deposition, higher insulin, higher growth hormone. So in hindsight, we should never have slaughtered that animal if he had good transmitting ability, because he has great genetics. So that's kind of a capsule of what we did and what measurements we made in that period of time.
For calves, heifers, and cows.
Well, let's take a look now at a graph that I developed when I was at Purina and published in Journal of Dairy Science in 1998. And this is a growth curves of over a period of a number of years. We measured calves and heifers. And you see that if you look at the black line, you look at that at first, it looks fairly linear. And it is after the first 2 months. The first 2 months, we don't want to grow heifers as fast. After that, it's about 1.8 to 2 pounds a day throughout that period of till about 24 months of first calf heifer. Now, if you look at the red line, which is the wither height, at first it looks fairly linear, but then as you get further along, you realize it looks more like it's curvilinear. And in further analysis, there are really three segments of that. And so that's bone growth, that's wither height measurement. The first segment is in the first 6 months. and they make half of their wither height increase or bone growth in the first 6 months. Uh, then for the next 6 months, for the next 3 months, they only make, uh, that's right, 50% in the first 6 months, 25% in the next 6 months, and only 25% in the last 6 months. So that's why it's very important that we have a good calf and heifer growing program so that we realize this height potential, because it's chronological, it's age related, and it's growth hormone related. And if it's not made in the first 6 months, you can't make that up later as compensatory growth, as you can do somewhat with body weight. So if we look then at how this relates to first calf and older animals, you see in the next table, again, some data we collected over about a 5-year period of time. You notice that a lot of times people will say, we want 1,200 pound first calf heifers. Well, unfortunately, sometimes they're not definitive enough. That's 1,200 pounds after first calving. So you really have to have some measurements before calving to know what their weight would be afterwards. And so we took these measurements, and you see that while they're 1,200 pounds after the first calving, there were 1,300, almost 50 pounds before. And that's because the calving process itself, there's the weight of the calf, the tissue and fluids associated with that birth, results in about an immediate 11% body weight loss. That's not counting any body condition loss in the first month or 2 or 3. And you notice that as you go into the second and third lactation, the third lactation is really about a mature animal. And you see there's some increase in their body weights, but they still lose about 11% of that body weight at calving. Now look at the wither heights. So this can vary with genetics and herd, but 54 inches is a typical wither height. Now, sometimes it's easier to take hip heights. So what would we look for if we had hip heights? Well, actually, it's very simple because we made some of those measurements as well. They would be about 2 inches higher. So if you took that hip height curve, you added 2 inches, the wither height curve, you added 2 inches, that would be your hip height curve. So you see there is some increase in height, but not much, about an inch in the first from first to second lactation, and then not quite an inch in the third lactation. Now, if you look at the weight of the calves from those lactation animals, you see that the female calves in first lactation are about 85 pounds. They are about 5 pounds more in the second lactation, and then about a pound more in the third lactation. If you look at the weight of the male calves, you see that they are about 5 to 6 pounds or more than the heifer calves, and they also increase by about 6 pounds from first to second to third lactation. On the average, male calves are about 7% greater in body weight than female calves. Now, that leads the question sometimes as to whether we should use male calves for calf growing study in the first 2 months or not. If you have an equal distribution of male and female calves by treatments, that should not be a bias. It would be a little bit more variation. And if you covariate adjusted those initial body weights, then that would take that out. So that's why very often male calves are often used for calf growing studies in the first 2 months. After that, they start to diverge more. Now let's go back to the calf growth period itself. When we look at calves that are born, they only have about 3 to 5% body fat. So that means they have over 70% water. And that's why it's very critical when calves have diarrhea, they can lose that water very quickly, and then they can dehydrate, and they can have a problem and actually die if they have too much loss of body weight due to diarrhea. So as the calf then grows, it will increase its fat composition from 3%, 3 to 5%, as we'll see in this study in the next graph. This was a study done at Cornell by a graduate student of Mike Van Emberg's, Tchaikovsky. They used male Holstein calves, and they fed them different milk replacers, but that were the same protein and fat levels, with similar energy. They fed them to gain about 1.3 pounds, and they were looking for an end weight of about 187 or 190 pounds, because that's the typical weight at that time for commercial dairy farms. Now, the live body weight differed in composition as we look at this graph. So the red is the protein level. You see that the percent of protein decreased as they increased the fat percentage in the milk replacer. And that was due to the fact that as the calves increase in fat due to more fat in the milk replacer, they decrease the amount of protein they deposit, and actually their bone growth, or the ash as you see on the blue line. So that tells us that there's got to be a happy medium for what we're trying to reach. And this was actually one of the early studies in developing what we call accelerated milk replacers. And that was a 28% protein and 15% fat milk replacer, because the actual fat levels on a full body weight was a 8.5% fat when they were fed 15% milk replacer, and then it went up to 11.5% or 11% when they were fed to 31%. So we weren't necessarily looking for that much higher fat, not when it's at the expense of protein and bone growth. Now that also leads us to a couple other key points. One of them is, all right, if we want to have calves grow faster, what's the impact of that? Well, calves and heifers that grow over 1 kilogram a day are going to get fatter. 1 kilogram a day is about 2.2 pounds. And the reason for that is that's about the maximum amount of protein that growing dairy animals and beef animals too can deposit. So if you grow them at a faster body weight, they're going to be primarily fattening. And I've had some dairies or calf operations say, well, I can grow my calves or gain 2.5 to 3 pounds. So back in 2007, I asked Mike Van Emberg about that at Cornell, and this is his exact words, and he said, I can quote him: any energy intake that allows for growth in excess of 2.2 pounds per day will end up as fat. That appears to be the upper limit for protein deposition. It's not encouraged and is usually done to overcome a bad or average calf growth program. Now, the other factor here too is that as if we fatten young calves or young heifers, that fattening increase is due to increase in the number of fat cells. There's a process called hyperplasia. After they're growing older, more mature, their fattening is an increase due to the size of those fat cells. So if you fatten animals at an early age, you develop more fat cells, and it more easily results in them fattening later, which can be a negative. And that's the same concern with humans. So that's the reason that we don't want fat babies or toddlers, because we may be setting them up for struggling with fattening the rest of their life because they have more fat cells developed. So that's kind of the practical aspect of that related to humans.
So lots of great information here, Al. How do you boil it down to like a key point or two?
Okay.
And how do we use this information? I mean, kind of just roll it all up for us, if you would give us a summary real quick.
Okay, the key points here are we don't want to fatten heifers and calves unduly. So if they have a fat body condition, as do cows, they're internally fat, and so it's a double whammy. So with growing heifers, we don't want them to exceed 1.8 to 2 pounds. There's some periods maybe up to 2.2. For young calves, we want to take their body weight at birth and double it at the end of 2 months. So that's about 1.5 pounds. So we don't want that to be exceeded because we don't want fat heifers. Fat heifers and fat cows have a number of metabolic problems. They have calving difficulty because they have too much internal fat and it restricts the birth canal area. So it's the old fat cow syndrome. We want to avoid that by not fattening calves and heifers as well.
Very good. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Kertz, for joining us here today. Lots of great information and insight, and even some history and some background, which is always important as well. Again, you can find Dr. Kurtz's column on this topic at feedstuffs.com or right down below. A couple of quick upcoming programming notes for you that are tuning in tomorrow at 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. Richard Brock of Brock Associates will be joining us, and he's going to provide a commodity marketing update. And he'll also, in part of that, he's going to take a look at the Ukraine on the wheat and corn side and what's going on there. Some very interesting statistics and charts you'll want to tune in. Next week, we'll be coming to you from World Pork Expo in Des Moines. We're going to have some live coverage, and some of that will be as we get on site. So we invite you to stop by our booth at V625, but also to stop by feedstuffs365.com and watch for our programming. You can join us on Feedstuffs 365 as well as on our social media sites. So until then, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.